Hey, hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm All Source News or Stefano Rindel. And in this episode, I'm going to be covering the latest developments impacting the state of Zacatecas, as I think there's a lot of interesting information there, and I haven't really done a deep dive related to this state that sees intense levels of violence between Los Maito Flacos, which is one of the factions of the Sinaloa cartel, and the Jalisco New Generation cartel. And there's a lot of external actors that play in this very important state. And it's probably one of the major conflict zones inside of Mexico. Specifically, we were talking about the Jalisco New Generation cartel and Maito Flaco war that is fought in various areas of Mexico, but with a huge concentration in Zacatecas. Before I go to the map, I think it's important to note that I find the Zacatecas conflict very interesting for one primary reason is that a lot of the fighting that we see is in very remote areas of Zacatecas, not necessarily only in the urban areas or towns, but a lot of them in the mountainous regions as well. Zacatecas does have a lot of mineral resources, and a lot of the fighting can also be explained because they want to have control of that. But I think Zacatecas, more broadly, is one of the case examples where cartels just fight in the broader context for just overall territorial control, regardless of how significant or insignificant the territory is. And with that, I'll go to the map and show you what I'm talking about. As shown here, this is kind of the overall kind of zoomed out, where's various areas of Zacatecas, and I'll go in and kind of zoom in a second. But here you can see the kind of the capital of Zacatecas, also the name of Zacatecas. And what's very important is Zacatecas is divided into two. Basically, the southern part of Zacatecas is controlled by the Jalisco New Generation cartel, and the northern part of Zacatecas is controlled by Maito Flaco, with the front line being this specific town of Villanueva, where active cartel maps rightly identified. And this is something where we kind of might consider kind of the border area. It's important to note that both the Maito Flacos and the Jalisco New Generation cartel love to go into Villanueva and kind of upload videos showing the sign of the city saying we control this town, and they do that for propaganda purposes. And a lot of times they kind of go in, take a video, and pull out. Lately, I would say my last assessment, and again, these are very fluid, and I want my listeners and viewers to understand, I wouldn't necessarily call them hardline front lines, similar to what we see in Russia, Ukraine, where there's a front line and maybe a gray zone, but there's clearly areas that are completely dominated by the Russians, and another area completely dominated by the Ukrainians, and then there's a gray zone area. The front lines, when we're talking about active, in Mexico, are a lot more fluid, and I would use that term loosely. Yes, there are specific towns inside of Mexico that are firmly under control of one cartel, but it's not hard for these guys to go in and out of rival territories, simply because in the main aspect, there's still the Mexican government, the Zacatecas government, that kind of is the primary security force, although they don't have the monopoly of violence. And you do see examples of convoys and members of one group going in and out of one town. Villanueva right now does appear to be under the control of the Jalisco New Generation cartel, but Maito Flaco groups are not that far out. And again, one of the interesting aspects of Zacatecas is this fighting that we see in kind of these remote areas, as you can kind of see in this map. A lot of remote areas regularly see conflicts, and more importantly, we're seeing a significant increase of both Jalisco New Generation cartel and the Maito Flacos utilizing drones to drop explosives on their rivals. And that is kind of one of the main aspects that we're seeing concentrated in Zacatecas. Again, all cartels in various conflict zones inside of Mexico, we do see drones dropping explosives. That's very common, but Zacatecas is probably one of the primary ones. And Zacatecas has seen violence for years now, and it's been a very, center of the war between the Sinaloa cartel and Jalisco New Generation cartel. Even before the Sinaloa cartel split, Zacatecas was the primary conflict area between the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel. And with the predecessor of Maito Flaco, his father being Mayo Zambada, we did see a lot of groups under Mayo Zambada fight in Zacatecas. Specific groups that we've seen fight in his Zacatecas historically have been, for example, Los Cabreras, Los Grupo Flechas. There's been a lot of groups, and now a lot of them are active more in Sinaloa. But the interesting aspect of this is even with the Sinaloa cartel civil war, which I'll zoom out for a second so you guys can visualize it right here, this civil war where we see a lot of forces of Maito Flaco kind of push over here, Maito Flaco still has a lot of active members here and very, very able to launch a lot of offensives. And it kind of demonstrates, I think, the strength of Maito Flaco in many ways, that he's able to fight in multiple conflict areas and still, put pressure on the Jalisco New Generation cartel, even in Zacatecas when he has the Sinaloa cartel civil war still being very active. And Zacatecas I think it's kind of bred itself into something bigger than what it really is in the terms of what the drug trafficking and et cetera. And I think that's something that is very important, that the violence there is much more active in Zacatecas, much more so than what I think we would see in other conflict areas. And it kind of demonstrates the importance that these groups have in just controlling territory, not necessarily the major drug trafficking routes or natural extractions. It's much more than that. But I think one of the interesting aspects that we're seeing, and I'll get to that in a second, is kind of these key groups and leaders active in Zacatecas and how they're playing a role in the fighting that's going on in that state. When analyzing CGNG, there's one key name that I want you guys to focus on in the conversation about Jalisco New Generation Cartel's presence in Zacatecas. This is an old sanction list from 2019, all the people you've seen here already in U.S. prison or have been in custody, but there's one key leader who is very high up there within the Jalisco New Generation rank. And that's a name that goes by the alias of El Sapo, also known as 090, 090. Is this guy right here. He has a very strong presence inside of Zacatecas, and a lot of his fighters are involved in the fighting currently with Jalisco New Generation Cartel against the Mayito Flacos in Zacatecas. And he's high up there. I mean, in many aspects, you can analyze him within the top three of the organization of Jalisco New Generation Cartel. Maybe the only other one that's more powerful than him before of El Mencho. And for those who don't know, this is El Mencho, the overall leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. The only one maybe that has more influence within El Sapo that you can make an argument is El Tres, who's basically considered the right-hand man of El Mencho. And El Sapo's forces are very well known to fight in Zacatecas. And recently, we've been seeing a very interesting development of additional forces that are being sent to fight in Zacatecas that are under the control of El Sapo. And I'd have to zoom out a little bit, but I've talked about them in a previous video about Tamaulipas, and it's these guys right here. The Metros that here have been identified as a Gulf Cartel faction, but in reality, they're just CGNG in Tamaulipas, right? The Metros are a key faction of Jalisco New Generation Cartel. Historically, they were viewed as a faction of the Gulf Cartel who were fighting the Grupo Escorpión, another faction of the Gulf Cartel. But Jalisco New Generation Cartel has basically absorbed them and made them part of Jalisco New Generation Cartel. There's a specific guy that is fighting right now in Zacatecas, who's a guy from the Metro, in Flaco Zecas. He Comandante Flaco. He is one of the key aspects, one of the key leaders of the Metros right now that is active in the Zacatecas region right here. And you can see in this graph right here, this is the Metros. They have an alliance with the old school Zetas. And this line right here denominates the alliance that they have with the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. And we do know that Metro members have been sent to Zacatecas to fight against Mayito Flaco. And I think one of the reasons why they've been able to do this is because historically, the Metros have been fighting kind of a two-front war. One against the Grupo Escorpión and another one against the Northeast Cartel, also known as CDN. But they do have a ceasefire since around February of this year. They do have a ceasefire with the Grupo Escorpión. That's here. The ceasefire, and I think that has enabled them to then send forces to help Jalisco New Generation Cartel fight in Zacatecas, because now they just have to focus on the CDN cartel. And I would say it does look like the Metros are having a little bit of an upper hand in their violence, and I have a previous video that kind of covers that. And this enables probably the Metros, since they're not fighting Grupo Escorpión, to send forces down to Zacatecas and fight. And we do have videos of that, of those fighters active there. The specific commander I mentioned actually has a very active social media presence. In TikTok and specifically, you can actually find him. One of his accounts recently got deleted, and he created a new one. And you can find his videos, and he's Metros, and he uploads videos of Metros fighting side by side with Jalisco New Generation Cartel against Mayito Flaco in Zacatecas. They actually launched an offensive a couple of weeks ago against various targets against Mayito Flaco and local police that they accused were supporting the Mayito Flacos around northern Zacatecas, kind of north of Villanueva. And again, even though that is really clearly predominant in territory of Mayito Flacos, and I'll kind of zoom in here a second to kind of show the kind of the areas I was talking about, right? We're talking about the, Villanueva being the border area. A lot of the violence happened around this area right here, and kind of the northern areas of Zacatecas that, again, that's where I was going back in the earlier part of my video. You can't analyze front lines as being firm, well-defined battle lines, there are opportunities to kind of go up and forth. And we do know that members of the Metros, in support of 090 or the Sapo of Jalisco New Generation Cartel, went north and started to attack various targets, both of the local police, the state police, and Maito Flacos in these areas of northern Zacatecas because of the support they were providing to Maito Flaco against the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. So that's an interesting development, that we do know that Metros are fighting not as an independent group or allies of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. No, they're subordinate to El Sapo. They're underneath El Sapo and fighting by his orders against Maito Flaco. And again, that's an interesting development because it continues to reinforce this idea that the Metros aren't a faction of the Gulf Cartel that has an alliance with the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. They are the Jalisco New Generation Cartel in Tamaulipas. And the ability of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel to absorb and subordinate those guys underneath them to fight against Maito Flaco just reinforces that key point of the Metros being CG&G. And it does kind of shows the strength that Jalisco Generation Cartel has of being able to pull forces from different parts of Mexico, even in areas that not necessarily is their home turf, because the Metros' home turf is Reynosa and Tamaulipas and Northeast Mexico. They were quickly able to go down to Zacatecas, fall underneath El Sapo, and launch these offenses there. And it kind of indicates that clearly El Sapo has a strong presence in Zacatecas. He's probably located in one of the regions in Zacatecas because we do see that his fighters are much more active there fighting there. On the Maito Flaco side, there's kind of a lot of groups, again, Los Cabreras, Grupo Flechas, and some of them get pulled to Sinaloa, but those are still kind of the primary ones that we've seen. Historically, in the past, when it was Mayo Zambada, they would kind of just go by just a normal name called Los Operativa MZ, but by the initials of Mayo Zambada. But now they're just kind of fighting within the banner of Maito Flaco. And again, some of those Cabreras and Grupo Flechas are key examples that are there. But they also get pulled to Sinaloa, but they're still very active. And in many instances, I can even make the argument that although Jalisco New Generation Cartel with the Metros reinforces, it does look like Maito Flaco might have a slight upper hand in Zacatecas compared to Maito Flaco. And it's not by much. But again, it's a very interesting dynamic when analyzing Maito Flaco. You would think that because the Sinaloa cartel split, now that he's fighting in Sinaloa too, that his forces would get pulled and it would be much harder for him to have a united front against Los Chapitos, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, especially when the Jalisco New Generation Cartel and Los Chapitos announced an alliance. It would be harder for Maito Flaco. But honestly, we're not necessarily seeing that in Zacatecas. He's still able to kind of push above his weight and continue to fight. And I think that's one of the main reasons why Maito Flaco is intent on just fighting anywhere and everywhere possible against any perceived rivals, because he wants this image because he knows where his father comes from. I mean, his father was the most powerful drug lord, not only in Mexican history, but arguably in the world, right? Maybe now El Mencho can kind of take that mantle, but the thing is, El Mencho is a fairly, in the long history of Mayo Zambada, El Mencho is a recent figure. Mayo Zambada has been doing this for 40 years, and he managed to build a name for himself and an international presence. And I think that kind of weighs in some way on Maito Flaco to push these offensive as strong as possible, regardless of who it is. And clearly, Jalisco New Generation Cartel, his primary rival, and now they're allies with Los Chapitos or the other ones. And again, this is kind of a very interesting dynamic. I talked about this in the previous video, these kind of forming of alliances, Maito Flaco with CDN, the Northeast Cartel. There were reports that have an alliance with Maito Flaco and possibly certain elements of CDN, specifically Los Chukis, are now in Sinaloa. But CDN also has historically had a presence in northern Zacatecas, right? I mean, if you look right here, this is kind of the CDN territory. Some of these areas do fall within northern Zacatecas, and historically CDN has had a presence. And I talked about this in my previous video, is the alliance between Maito Flaco and CDN against Los Chapitos and Jalisco New Generation Cartel in Sinaloa is one of maybe those stipulations. If we see more of this, do we start seeing increased presence of CDN in Zacatecas? And kind of going back to the areas that they predominantly had control about that they've lost within the last couple of years, because CDN had a much more stronger presence in northern Zacatecas, and they've been kind of losing that. Do you see now, because of an alliance with Maito Flaco, do you see that? And that's the alliance right here, the marking right here, right? This is kind of an interesting aspect that this CDN right here alliance with Maito Flaco is the idea then that CDN is able to kind of increase their presence in northern Zacatecas, because there's a lot of business alliance between Maito Flaco and CDN. They push drugs into CDN territory than just in the United States. So do you see CDN increase their presence in Zacatecas. And just as the metros and CDN are fighting in northeast Mexico, specifically Tamaulipas and Nuevo León, as the metros are in Zacatecas supporting Jalisco Generation Cartel, does CDN send forces to Maito Flaco and Zacatecas? And now you see CDN and metros battle each other out in Zacatecas in addition to here. And it's kind of this weird scenario of direct conflict, but now spreading because of alliances, right? You would think that the CDN metros conflict would be kind of isolated here, but with this alliance, is that something I'm looking for in Zacatecas? CDN coming back into Zacatecas, a stronger presence, and fighting not only Jalisco New Generation Cartel, but the metros in these areas of Zacatecas. And that does open a lot of opportunities for CDN. And I cannot stress enough how violent CDN is and how much they terrorize northern Mexico. I think that would be a disaster for Zacatecas, even much more so than it is right now, if we see an increased presence of CDN in Zacatecas. But that's something I'm looking for, because all the reporting again is CDN is in Sinaloa. Do we see them now go to Zacatecas? And again, in Zacatecas, I think one of the key aspects is just kind of the center of Mexico, right? And not necessarily Mexico, but at least in the drug trafficking route into the United States, there's a lot of key roads and highways in doing that, and other aspects of Zacatecas that's important that might enable CDN to increase their influence and their territorial control, because now they have more territory and routes that they can leverage for drug trafficking into the United States. So they have a vested interest. And next to Zacatecas is Durango, and Durango is a well-known area where methamphetamine is produced, right? And so a lot of the Maito Flaco drugs, specifically methamphetamines that are produced in Durango, that get sent to the United States, goes through CDN territory, through Nuevo Laredo, and then into Laredo, Texas. Does this alliance enable CDN to maybe establish their own methamphetamine drug labs in Durango, and enable to them to now not be so reliant on just receiving products and taking a fee because they receive product, because that's now their business model? Are they able to manufacture their own drugs? That's why we've seen CDN so heavily involved in human smuggling, because it was a lot of money for them, and they weren't necessarily so reliant on other actors. That was something that they could do on themselves. But does this enable them to expand in their own drug production capabilities that right now is not very high, and if anything, non-existent? Does this alliance with Maito Flaco enable them to expand in that in Durango? But Zacatecas is a key component of that to enable that drug route, because if they lose Zacatecas, it really chokes the hold on Maito Flaco's territory and their ability to push drugs into the United States, because now they're running into significant problems because they don't have that much other territory to do it. And I think that's one of the main components of Zacatecas and the road, is kind of this crossroad of drugs heading north into the United States, and even human smuggling into the United States, or other products and other drugs that is necessary. And I think that's the reason why we see all the violence in Zacatecas. Zacatecas doesn't get enough attention that it deserves. We see a lot of conflicts, daily battles, drones, dropping explosives devices, etc. And this video is an attempt to kind of give a summary of what's going on. Because again, for my listeners who maybe not listened to me before, when you're analyzing the cartels in Mexico and the kind of the cartel violence, it's not one cartel war. It's not one cartel battle. It's multiple conflicts in Mexico that some of them have overlaps, but others are completely distant and have nothing to do with each other. And that's how you have to analyze Mexico, right? Analyze all these different conflicts and see where there's overlap or they're completely separate, to have a better understanding of what's not going on, and not just say cartels are doing X. It's very important to go down into these specific groups. In Zacatecas, I would say, there's two main actors, Maito Flaco and Jalisco New Generation Cartel. We might see minor players like CDN and the metros increase their presence there, but there'll still be the minor players. The two main players that are going to determine the future of Zacatecas from a cartel's perspective is Maito Flaco and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. And within the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the one name you need to be looking at is El Sapo. That is the key one. And he is high up in the leadership ladder of Jalisco New Generation Cartel. And there is a possibility that he might be the future leader of Jalisco New Generation Cartel in case something happens to Mencho. So that's why it's important to know that name and to have an understanding of what he does. But with that, I'm going to end this video. Thank you so much for listening to this latest round of me trying to give explanations on conflict zones inside of Mexico and the cartel violence. Please let me know what you think in the comments if you have any questions. And more importantly, let me know what you want me to discuss next, because I love doing these videos and I apologize, it's been a while since I did that. But until then, I'll see you next time.